Yeah.
The conference has been muted.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Strategic Planning for Economic Development Organizations webinar. This is a replication of a presentation that I did for the Basic Economic Development course in Pennsylvania back in December of this year. Every year, as part of the Governor's Action Team, the Department of Community and Economic Development in Pennsylvania hosts a course on basic economic development skill building. And for the past, I don't know, it's almost 10 years, I think, I've been doing the strategic planning component of it. And this particular presentation actually includes all of the content of that presentation, as well as the results of the polling that I did with the group that was in the room that day. So I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the results we got from the polling of the group that was assembled back in December. And we're also going to be talking about the content of the strategic planning process. And for any of you who just joined us, I have this conference in mute mode. If you have any questions that you would like to submit over the course of the presentation, please do it through the chat feature, and then I'll have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. As I start this presentation, as I've been starting every presentation that I think I've done over the last 6 months or so, I remind my audiences that a critical success factor for sustainability is, in fact, challenging our assumptions. In order to be successful in today's environment, we must continually challenge our assumptions about what we think we know in order to be sustainable for the future. For those of you who don't know much about Strategy Solutions, my company actually exists to create healthy communities. And we work on creating healthy communities through an intersection of private sector wealth-creating companies and supporting the work for those wealth creators in communities. We also believe that healthy communities are supported by strong community and government infrastructure, the public sector, government, workforce economic development, and education, as well as the social service sector, which is community and faith-based organizations and healthcare. All of those sectors in the community must work together effectively in order to create a healthy community. We also believe in and support healthy organizations. And healthy organizations are created at the intersection of strong operations, strong finance, and strong support services, all working together. I polled the group when we were together in December and asked them, about what sector they were from. And this was the demographics of the sectors that we had at the event back in December. I also asked folks in the room whether they had a lot of strategic planning experience, some or little or no planning experience. And this is pretty representative. When I have a group of 40 to 50 people, this is a pretty representative of the types of experience that I have in the group. I also talked to people about, the different kinds of planning that they may have experienced in the past. And I found that there's a couple of different types of planning. The first one is the historical type of plan, which is last year's budget plus 5% or minus 5%, depending on what industry you're in. Some people have experience with what I call the dust collector. It's 200 pages long. It took 2 years to create, and then it sits on the shelf. And then there's my very favorite, which is what I call the warm fuzzy, which is the half-day facilitated retreat where we all sat around and sang Kumbaya, and then nothing happened. And that warm fuzzy type of planning is what a lot of people in nonprofit organizations do on a regular basis, and then they call that planning. And I actually think that planning is something else. And back in December, a number of the folks that participated in the event actually did have some other type of experience with planning. And there are some people in today's world that state that well, maybe we shouldn't plan because the world changes so fast that as soon as we write the plan down, it becomes irrelevant. But we really should be using plans and doing planning today as a baseline for us to adapt from, because it's really important today to create consensus. I asked the question of the group, well, how would you rate your strategic planning experience? And what's interesting is that I often get a lot of people in groups that have or consider their past experience with planning fair or poor. And the reasons for that is that people aren't engaged, a few people make the decisions, there's not good follow-through, there's difficulty with actually implementing the plans in a way that makes sense, and a whole variety of other challenges actually exist that make it difficult to really say I've had an excellent job planning. So we're going to talk today about the board's role in planning and oversight, because I found that the board has a lot to do with whether or not the organization is successful moving forward. We're going to talk about the planning model, what I consider to be the price of admission for sustainability for economic development organizations and communities moving forward, and then how to get there from here. Strategic planning is not a very complicated process, even though in our model we do what I consider to be a planning process that's a little more robust than most. We're asking 5 basic questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How are we going to get there? Who's going to do what? And how are we doing? And then we should also be looking at where is the board? And are we doing an evaluation of the board's role in the process? And I found, not just in working with economic and community development organizations, but with nonprofits in general, a lot of people don't understand the legal duties of a nonprofit board. And there's 3 of them. The duty of obedience, which is staying true to the mission. The duty of care, which means the organization and the board members are really doing their due diligence and being careful stewards of the organization's resources and the financial and compliance aspects of the organization. And then the third duty is the duty of loyalty, that regardless of conflicts of interest, that every board member actually makes decisions that are in the best interest of the agency, not of the constituency they represent. And those are very important aspects of what it means to serve on a board. The role of the board in planning is to understand fiduciary responsibility. And when you ask people about fiduciary responsibility, most people equate that with financial stewardship. Yeah, we watch the money. But fiduciary responsibility goes further than that. And when a person agrees to be on the board, the fiduciary responsibility and obligation they have is to sustain the mission as long as the need exists in the community. And based on the mission, the board member's responsibility is to provide direction regarding the vision, input into the plan, and the resources necessary to implement the plan, and to develop performance criteria for the CEO. And one of the things that we will send out to those of you participating on this email is a toolkit of resources that go along with this presentation, that including an article that I wrote last year for the National Standards magazine on performance evaluation criteria and how to do a good performance evaluation for a CEO. Many times, while the board's responsibility is to develop performance criteria for the CEO, a lot of boards don't do that process well. And I wrote an article about how to do the mechanics of that better. And the board's role is also to recognize that the staff is responsible for developing and implementing the plan. I will also send out copies of this presentation to everyone that is participating in the webinar today, because I some of the material I'm not going to talk about in detail, such as the 10 basic responsibilities of the nonprofit board, which include determining the mission and purpose, selecting and supporting the chief executive, ensuring good planning, monitoring performance, and legal compliance. I've also included the hallmarks of an effective board, which is and includes working together and having clarity about the roles and responsibilities and really doing their work effectively as a corporate unit and working together to support the organization. I ask people, when was the last time your board did a governance assessment? Because best practices suggest that every board should do a governance assessment at least every 2 years. And a lot of organizations don't do it in the right time frame. Or if they do a governance assessment, they don't necessarily do it well. And one of the problems that many boards have is that regardless of the assessment criteria, the board rates their effectiveness really, really well, even though they may not have been performing all that well from a governance perspective. And what I've been educating our client boards about over the last few years is that the board should be strategically aligned with and supporting the program of work of the agency, and that each of the board committees should have an agenda of work that supports the organization moving forward, and that is part of the board's role in planning. So I ask people as part of these presentations, well, how effective is your board at supporting the strategic direction of the organization? And in most cases, when I ask groups of people this question, they rate their boards as only somewhat effective in their role because they're really not as strategically aligned as they could be, and they're not necessarily supporting the strategic implementation. I also ask people, well, which comes first? Should we do macro planning, county or region-wide planning? Should we do micro planning for an individual agency first? Should we do those things at the same time? Or it doesn't matter as long as they're both done at some point. And what's interesting about this is I consider number 4 of this poll the correct answer, because it really doesn't matter which is done as long as you know the scope of what you're talking about. Although I would argue that it's much easier to do macro planning first so that we have an idea of what the economic development strategy is for our region, our county or our region, and we define our role, whether we're an economic development agency or a community development or a workforce development agency. We can look at what our role is in supporting that broader regional agenda and craft our local or organizational strategic plans around that agenda. And that's going to give us a much better outcome. But you could do, especially if you're in a situation where you work for a local or a regional economic development agency who might be the facilitator of a macro planning effort, you could in fact do your individual agency's plan first and make facilitating a macro plan part of your agency's strategic direction moving forward. With that as the backdrop, I'm going to talk about what's broken about today's planning model. And in most cases, what we're finding is that the way most people do strategic planning in today's environment, it's not sufficient anymore. It doesn't, in some cases, it doesn't even work. And why is that? Well, first of all, the classic concept of strategy looks to match the organization to the environment. We're trying to look at what's going on, how do we match. A lot of people do SWOT analysis, where they're looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and strengths and weaknesses have to do with the internal workings of the agency. Opportunities and threats have to do with what's going on in the external environment. And typically we take that along with management's vision and some stakeholder priorities, and we craft our strategy around that. Okay? The problem with that is, in today's environment, is that if you are not matching those things up to what is going on with the industry trends and what's happening in the industry, and that both your local companies are working in, as well as what's happening in your own world, you could do a SWOT analysis and be all wrong. So you could be all on the same page, but it could be the wrong page. The other thing that you have to recognize in today's environment is that the price of sustainability is generating enough cash to innovate at the rate of change of the marketplace or ahead of it. And this is what is causing a lot of agencies today concern, because some people may recognize that they don't have a sustainable business model in a small to medium-sized organization. They just don't know what to do about it. And what we're recommending is that people start to look at bringing in and building the capacity and the capability in their agencies to provide real-time product and industry life cycle analysis. And as I look at what's happening with a lot of economic development agencies across the country, is that they're now bringing data analytical capabilities in and building it into the staff capacity, because once upon a time, we could do some data analysis once every 3 years or once every 5 years. We can craft a plan around it, and we'd be okay to implement that plan over the next few years. We can't do that anymore. We need to have real-time market information. We need to have real-time voice of the customer information from what's going on with our clients in the marketplace to be able to adapt at the pace of change in the marketplace. The other thing we have to really do is be at the level of technical capacity in order to be sustainable. And this graph comes out of a textbook that I use in a class I teach for Duquesne University called Navigating the Organizational Life Cycle. And what this suggests is that organizations, as they get to maturity, they are in startup and then adolescence, and they get to maturity, they have to sustain themselves there. And maturity is not about chronological age. It's about capacity to be sustainable. And there's 4 types of capacity: leadership, management, technical, and adaptive. And I'll explain them in a few minutes. But what I've been finding over the last few years primarily is that organizations, they typically go from startup into adolescence, adolescence into maturity. But what's happening is that small organizations that are in startup mode are tanking. They're going out of business before they ever get to adolescence. Sort of like entrepreneurs. Many startup companies don't actually make it past the first year. They can't make it into adolescence. Or if they're around for 5 years, they can't make it into maturity. So what do you need to do in order to get there? And what I've been finding is that if your organization is anything but a 4, 5, or 7, if you're not on the cusp of maturity or building some new curve, if you're anywhere else in the organizational life cycle, you probably don't have a sustainable business model. And what does that mean? Okay? And I asked the group that I had together in December, most of them were somewhere, building the new curve. But some of them were declining before they hit maturity. Some of them we found were actually declining. And the question becomes, how do we ensure that we get to maturity and have sustainability? I mentioned that these are the 4 components of capacity: leadership, management, technical, and adaptive. And here's how they are defined. Adaptive capacity is the ability to monitor, assess, respond to, and stimulate internal and external changes. This is hard, especially when you don't have the staff capacity to build new programs and services. Or in leadership capacity, the ability to inspire, prioritize, make decisions, and innovate. We also have management and technical capacity. And a lot of organizations are actually managed quite well. There's good oversight for the efficient and effective use of organizations' resources. The problem becomes, in today's environment, you have to be a technical expert in 14 different things in order to be sustainable. And if you look at this list of technical capacities that organizations need to have, product development planning, outreach and advocacy, and in some cases organized lobbying, program operations or standardization of those program operations so that they can be replicated in a franchise-like method, outcomes measurement and program evaluation, those kinds of things weren't even on this list 2 years ago because most organizations struggle with things like information technology, access to capital, accounting, fundraising, marketing, and communications. You've got to have a staff of 15 or 16 people at least to be able to cover all these technical capacities. It makes it difficult for organizations, especially small ones, to do it. And the most significant challenge today is that training and capacity building alone is not going to be sufficient to address these technical needs. And we've been encouraging our clients over the last few years to start to think about how do they combine with other organizations or share resources to create synergies and to lower fixed operating costs, because we can't afford all these technical capacities. And this graph is a testimony to most organizations are somewhat equipped, and very few organizations feel that they're very equipped on all of those technical capacities. And what ends up happening is we struggle. We struggle to get the things done. We struggle to get strategic investment. We struggle to get the various things that we want to have implemented. So what do? We have to be thinking about leaving our administrative systems as the way we know it and start to think about new strategies and what does it mean for us to build that new curve. And I put this graph in here, this slide in here, even though this was developed by the American Hospital Association about what's happening in healthcare. Healthcare is moving from what they call first curve economics to second curve economics, which is all about changing from volume-based to value-based. And I like this slide because it explains the components of a product-service bundle, which we've been witnessing in a lot of other sectors. But healthcare explains it as part of their forecasting in a way that I think is meaningful. I use it to really challenge our clients to think about what is our next curve in economic development. What is our next curve, and what is the product-service bundle that we have to offer? I also have this slide that lays out the various components of our strategic planning model. And you'll notice, the things I want you to notice on here, because you can't read the details, is that only half of the model is strategic planning, or what most organizations consider to be strategic planning. And the right side of the model is all about implementation management. And what we've been finding is that a lot of times plans sit on the shelf, or they don't get implemented well, or they struggle with funding or staffing, mostly because the organizations don't manage that implementation process well. And the things that are in that box there, organizational and funding strategies, they don't take the time to think through those things in a way that allows them to make a case for support to fund their strategic plans, so they don't get done. And that's why a lot of plans sit on the shelf. We've also modified this model over the last 6 months or so to put in those 2 red boxes, which are processes that we used to do when people asked us to do them. Scenario analysis is one of them, and the other one is board alignment and support. We would do those things when people asked us to, but now we've incorporated them into our basic planning operation because we've found that every one of our clients now needs to look at various scenarios, needs to have a contingency plan in case, something that they're planning to do doesn't work out the way they want it to, and they must have their boards and their board committee structure actually align behind the plan, because if they don't have that well, it makes it more difficult to actually get their strategic plan implemented. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the phases of the planning process now. Our first part is the environmental assessment part and includes these different elements: mission, vision, looking at market needs, capabilities. And when we do a needs assessment for an organization, these are the things that we're doing. We're doing an operations review. We're looking at the industries. We're looking at demographics. We're looking at community needs assessments. We'll actually conduct stakeholder interviews and stakeholder forums and look at what are other communities doing in terms of benchmarking research. We encourage our clients to create what I call a strategic profile or an operational definition of their vision. Many organizations have vision statements that are warm, fuzzy, lovely statements, but they really don't help you much in terms of what the organization wants to look like. We encourage our clients to really be very specific. How are our products different than what they are today? How are our markets different? Are our clients going to be different? What are our size and growth guidelines? And really try to have them be very concrete. What does your organization look like today? Many organizations today are unbalanced. They have one service or product that's the majority of their business, or one funding stream where they get the majority of their resources. And many organizations say, well, we'd like to be bigger and we'd like to be more balanced. But what specifically does your organization want to do? And then how do you get there from here? Your strategic plans should be very specific about the activities that you're going to do to get from here to there, and outline those things that are going to help you do that. And then you can develop goals and objectives and program possibilities. Strategic plans should always be a set of goals and objectives, all on one page. A one-page summary looks something like this. It has goals, it has objectives, and I encourage our clients never to have more than 5 goals. And the reason for that is that people have 5 fingers, and you want to be able to say, we're working on this, 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 and this, and actually point it out on your fingers as you're talking about it. And it makes it much easier for you to communicate your plan. And once the goals and objectives are outlined, we have been encouraging our clients now to look at scenario planning. And a scenario plan actually includes, you look at the various planning elements that you might have. How does this impact your programs? How is it going to impact your fundraising? How is it going to impact your customer service? And then we look at 4 different scenarios. We usually label them A, B, C, and D. We create descriptions of what each of those scenarios might be. By scenario A, we try to make it the best case. Scenario D, we try to make it the worst case. And scenarios B and C, we try to make it some combination of environmental factors in between. And essentially, we make this matrix, we outline the planning elements, and then we sit down and talk about, well, what would we do under these circumstances related to our fundraising? What would we do under these circumstances related to our programs? What would we do under these circumstances related to relationships in the community? And basically outline it and think through each of the scenarios that way. That's very helpful in case something goes wrong. In order to operationalize the plan, we really force our clients to sit down and look at the objectives and program possibilities and make assignments to research and create the models, the program models. What's the human capital and operating resources required to implement it? What are the outcomes? What's the capacity to implement the plan? And what level of resources are required for the organization to be sustainable over and above what goes into that particular objective? And we force our clients to go through this exercise because we find that, first of all, many of the organizations underestimate what it takes to get a plan implemented. We also found that if an organization is trying to do 2 or 3 or 4 major priorities or initiatives at the same time, the organization may need some additional staff capacity that it doesn't have in order to get the plan done, or it might need additional infrastructure like information systems or some type of hardware or software that isn't necessarily tied to a particular objective. The other thing that we found as you go through and operationalize the plan and you start to outline the action plan, which looks like this: objectives, action steps, accountability, budget, and time frame. Once you have it all laid out, every organization that we've ever worked with has sequenced the implementation of the plan differently than what they might consider to be their top priorities. Because the top priority that needs to be accomplished over the next 2 or 3 years may not, in fact, be the first thing you do. And in fact, many organizations need to do some infrastructure building strategies before they are able to implement some of their key initiatives. So it's really helpful to lay out the full plan, to organize it in a way that makes sense sequentially. So you could have a plan that has 27 goals and objectives on it, 27 different objectives, but you want to lay it out into buckets. These are the initiatives that we're going to do first, maybe 7 or 8 this year, 7 or 8 next year, and then these things happen the following year. And the sequencing of it, we found, is a critical success factor in actually implementing it. The other thing that we've, again, started to do once we get to the implementation, and once you've done those organizational and funding strategies, you can start to look at delegated objectives and defined action plans. And we then give tangible assignments to individuals and groups. And one of the things that I didn't mention earlier is that the people who are assigned to do the action planning aren't necessarily the people who are assigned to actually implement it once it's deemed an important priority for the plan. Those assignments are given last after the plan is approved. And then program and funding packages can be assembled for portions that require external funding, and accountability systems and deadlines are determined. And in order to create that alignment between the staff and the board, we have the staff work through the action plan so that the plan is clear, relevant, significant, achievable, and urgent. And then we create an agenda of board committee work that supports the implementation of the plan. We work on governance excellence and ensure that the board has a governance committee that looks at board performance. Even for economic development agencies, we work with the organizations to ensure that the boards get involved in fundraising and in member and sponsorship cultivation. And we help the board ensure that the executive director performance criteria is based on organizational performance and strategic plan accomplishment, not just on sort of anecdotal feelings that, oh, gee, the executive director is doing a good job based on the point of view of, maybe 1 or 2 board members. And then the last step is for the organization to look at measures of success, rewards and recognition, and some type of measurement and follow-up. And we encourage the monitoring and review process should include establishing 10 to 12 global measures of success, and then determining how those indicators will be tracked and within what time frame, and how you're going to monitor and celebrate the rewards that you have and the accomplishments that you have. And a lot of organizations shortcut this process, and they don't invest in their outcomes measurement work. And then they wonder why they don't have good outcomes. I put this next slide in here because it talks about the types of evaluations that organizations can do. There's a number of different types of evaluations. There's needs assessments, there are process evaluations, there's outcome evaluation, and then there's impact evaluation. And on the top part of the right-hand side of this slide, the new impact question that we've been seeing funders and major donors ask over the last few years is this question: does the program deliver better outcomes and save the system money? Those are really the key strategic questions that people are looking at. And in order to make a decision in investment, is there going to be a tangible return on investment of this program effort? So I asked the people who were in the room, do you quantify and publish outcomes and impact? And the good news about the folks that were in the room back in December is that about a third of them were already quantifying and publishing both outcomes and impact, although there are still some organizations that were part of the group back then that weren't doing that. I also always ask the question, well, how well does your organization make a case for support for funding? Because we found that this is a critical success factor in whether or not organizations are going to be successful in raising the dollars that they need to do in order to achieve their next level of accomplishment. And this next slide is actually an example of a case for support that was done for Allegheny Land Trust, which is a very small nonprofit in southwest Pennsylvania that a few years ago was struggling for viability. They had one and a half staff people and didn't really have a strategic agenda. And what we did with them as part of their planning process was look at, what should drive land conservation and what are the areas that they should be looking at in terms of land conservation to support biodiversity and water quality and scenic vistas. And they came up with this rubric that they called the Community Greenprint, which immediately got funded by a number of foundations to help them actually, first of all, establish what the Greenprint was, but then build the parameters of the Greenprint into the comprehensive plan in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. And the organization has since been working on actually conserving the land that is important to conservation. And the reason why this is, for those of you who may not be familiar with the geography in southwest Pennsylvania, the reason why this is important to economic development is because Hurricane Ivan a few years ago, when it hit Pittsburgh, actually caused billions of dollars worth of damage because there's too much development too close to the rivers and streams, and the land had lost its sponge factor. And a lot of the local foundations were very concerned that somebody really take that big picture view of what was important in terms of land conservation and how that fit into economic development. So what's been interesting about Allegheny Land Trust is that they got immediately about $700,000 worth of investment into this process and into the organization, and they now have a staff of, 8 or 9, and have been doing a good job of actually conserving and supporting the land since then, and getting people rallied around the cause for conservation. So it's just an example of how things could be shifted. Another thing that we've been encouraging our clients to think about over the past 6 months or so is, how do you really do innovation in your organization? And I encourage people to read this book. This book is written by 2 Dartmouth professors, and it'll take you about an hour and a half to read if you're a slow reader, and it'll take you an hour to read if you're a fast reader. And this really is about a sheep. Stella is standing there, showing a picture of an alpaca. And what's cute about the book is that it allows you to think about how innovation in organizations is often thwarted, because organizations are designed to do the work they do today, not create the reality of tomorrow. And they wrote the book, the 2 professors wrote the book because they found that their clients were having trouble wrapping their heads around some of the concepts of innovation that they espoused in their book called The Other Side of Innovation. And the story about Stella, because it's a fable, it's one of those fable books like Who Moved My Cheese, it allowed people to understand the concepts better. And it's really helpful because we really need to assess how we organize and plan for innovation. And what these two professors have found is that you can't ask the group that's in charge of today to also be in charge of tomorrow, because the urgent is always going to squeeze out the important. And many of us have trouble making the important, not urgent, urgent in order to get it done, because any of us have a number of screaming priorities that are screaming at us on any given day. And years ago, when we had more capacity, we could get a lot more done with innovation. But every organization, I don't care what industry you're in, is so lean today that it's very difficult to do innovation at the same time. And what we've been encouraging our clients to think about as they do their planning and as they do their organizational capacity analysis is how do we create project teams that are a partnership between some shared staff that already exist in the organization and a dedicated team of possibly new people or consultants that help us achieve an organizational objective. And if you're going to build a project team, you have to divide the labor between the dedicated team and the shared staff. You have to assemble them, and then you have to manage the partnership with clear expectations. And again, many organizations fail in their innovation efforts because they expect existing staff that have existing accountabilities that are part of the operations of the business to do all of these extra things that they just don't have time and resources to do. So you also want to support those transitions and recognize that when you're trying to do some innovation initiative, the change is situational, but transition is psychological. And we've got to help people change their thinking in order to support transitions in an organization and transition their own thinking to a new world. We also find that sometimes people don't recognize that they're trying to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. And there's an immunity to change that we find that sometimes people have trouble getting past past their own immunities. So we ask people, how innovative is your organization? And most say they're only somewhat or not innovative. This is a very common response that I get out of a group of people that I'm talking to. And we've been challenging folks to think about the fact that we are trying to solve adaptive challenges with technical solutions. And that is a problem, because we're not really adapting in the right way. We can come up with a 50-point action plan, but if we're not recognizing that there's something else that are keeping people stuck, and we found that people have this immunity, and these immune systems create blind spots that prevent learning and constrain action. And most people would argue that they're not stuck because they're afraid. But yet, and there's a lot of times that most people are dealing constantly with fear that they don't feel fear because they're dealing with it. And we educate our clients to challenge their assumptions by recognizing that everybody in the world has a different mental model. We all have different mental models. We look at the world differently. And mental models are often, they're founded on obscure or incomplete facts, but they are information filters that allow us to have selective perception where we're looking at only parts of information. And one of the things that often happens, and this creates conflict in a lot of organizations, is that people do what's called jumping up the ladder of inference. They look at observable data as might be captured by a video recorder, and they add meaning to it based on their particular perception. Like, for example, somebody comes in late to a meeting, and you automatically assume that they're late because they don't care about the agenda. They don't care, they're not bought into the process. But meanwhile, they might have had a car accident on the way to the meeting, and you don't know that. But you add meaning to their behavior without asking. And what we found is that oftentimes those inferences or our assumptions based on our meta model create hidden commitments, or we have commitments to other things that we feel are going to be violated by doing things differently. So organizations stay stuck because they have these opposing forces coming at each other. Yeah, we might have a self-improvement goal, but we also have these hidden commitments that are keeping us stuck. So I ask people, how are they doing? And most organizations say they're doing reasonably well, but they face barriers from time to time, or they're stuck on a few things that hold us back. And in today's world, these couple of things that hold us back, if we don't figure out how to challenge our assumptions with them and move past them, it may make the difference between sustainability and not. We also ask people, well, how organized is your board structure? Many people say it's as good as it can be, and in some cases, folks are pretty well organized. But in other cases, there's room for improvement. And we also ask people, how well aligned are you with your plan? And most organizations say that they are either not well aligned or somewhat aligned, but they don't really have a good agenda of work for their committees. So we actually encourage people to think about and actually do an intentional process where you're looking at planning for each of the committees. And here's an example of a board organization chart for an economic development organization that would include an executive committee, a governance committee, a program and facilities committee, or different programs committees. In economic development, we might have sites, we might have loan review, we might have new industry recruitment, we might have local industry development, we might have government relations. And each of those committees could do a different aspect of the program of work for the Economic Development Agency. Could have a membership development committee that helps to get more sponsorship and more support for the agency, and a finance committee that works on financial, the financial aspects moving forward. And we encourage you that are listening to this webinar that if your organization is not well organized or your board is not well aligned behind your strategic agenda, or if there's a couple of things that are keeping you stuck and holding you back, it's really worth the effort to put some investment into figuring out how to get unstuck or how to get better aligned on some of those issues, because those things will make a great deal of impact in a positive way on your ability to implement your strategic plan. The next few slides in this presentation are an example of a macro planning approach, which works very much like the micro planning approach I just described, but changes the environmental assessment process a little bit. The environmental assessment process, whereas instead of focusing on the particular agency, we focus on looking at what's going on in the global environment, and encourage our clients to look at reports and factual information. If you're doing a macro plan, what are all of the studies that have been done over the past 10 or 15 years? What's in your comprehensive plan? What are the themes and conclusions there? Gather new information on trends and conditions, the economy and workforce, housing, energy analysis, transportation and infrastructure, and the environment. Look at what's happening. Gather input from stakeholder forums in the community via surveys and focus groups. Do what I call a roles and players analysis. And this is something that's very unique to Strategy Solutions. Look at all of the groups and organizations that are currently playing a role in economic development, and look at who's doing what and how well are we doing it. And on this slide, I have the different areas of economic development that include intelligence and data gathering, sources of funding, business retention, enterprise creation. All of these things may not be done by one agency. You may have 7 or 8 different agencies in a region doing these various things, but how well do they work together? And how should they do? So we encourage what I call an ideal model subcommittee, which is a small work group charged to envision the ideal model of how the system should work in your local area. And how close are you today to what your ideal model looks like? And then do you want to do anything to fill in the gaps? I found that this is a great strategy to get agencies all on the same page in a particular region working together to accomplish a macro plan. I also encourage people to do best practice research from different places around the country that they might be interested in, to do a data review meeting prior to any type of planning meeting so that people can review the data, they can look at it, they can draw conclusions from it, and then have a team planning retreat or a conference, at least a full day, maybe a day and a half or 2 days, to really look at what are our goals and objectives and among group members, and then do some significant action planning, and then schedule periodic reviews. And in summary, if you really want to raise the bar of organizational effectiveness in an economic development agency, you want to create a culture of excellence starting at the top, do good board governance evaluation, and really look at how the board supports the planning process. Conduct ongoing needs assessments, both quantitative and qualitative, on a regular schedule and respond to needs, and then have strategic plans both for your organization and for the macro region, and measure your success. And as I close, I want to just remind everyone, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world, because indeed it's the only thing that ever has. And I encourage those of you who are involved in economic development planning to keep working on refining your process, to making it more robust and more reflective of the community needs. And if you feel you need any help or have any questions, I'm happy to respond to those questions. So
The conference has been unmuted.
I'm going to ask if anybody on the line has any questions about the content of today's webinar, or had any questions or discussion that they wanted to have. So I give you the opportunity to do that.
Got anything, Jen?
No. Any questions? Hearing none, I'm going to say thank you for participating today. I'm going to stop the recording and stay on the line for a few minutes if anyone decides they do have any additional questions.
Thank you. Please stand by.